Hello, my name is Anson Asaka. I'm the founder of New Possibilities. And today I'm going to do something that I haven't done in a while, and that's a book review. I'm going to review the book titled The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Here's a copy of the book, and I encourage everyone to read this book. This book is about how the United States went from one caste system to another caste system. Initially, we started out with slavery, then we moved to Jim Crow, and this latest phase of oppression or caste system is called the mass incarceration system, or what Michelle Alexander refers to as the new Jim Crow. And in this brief video, I will explain to you what the new Jim Crow is in basic terminology and try to be as concise as possible. This is a very comprehensive book, and I encourage you all to read it. There's no way to cover all the topics raised in this book within a short YouTube video, so I encourage you again to read the book yourself. But essentially, this book is about how the war on drugs is what we all know it to be. It's a war on poor black people. It is a response to the gains of the civil rights movement. And the thing that makes this war so threatening and so deadly is the fact that it's used under the guise of being a colorblind system, of being a system that's fair, of being a system that's essentially designed to punish criminals, when in fact it is not that. It is a system that is targeted towards African Americans. It is a system that is destroying our communities. And it is a system that we must speak out against and we must fight against and change. This war on drugs involves discrimination at every single level of the criminal justice system. From the policing level, where the police officer racially profiles people for targeting, at the stop level, when they stop people, they search people, interrogate people. So there's discrimination on the policing level. There's discrimination on the prosecution level in terms of what cases are being filed or charged, what cases are moving forward, the extent of the potential charges, the jury selection process, and even at the stage of sentencing, there's great racial disparity and great institutionalized and systemic racism. And sadly, as Michelle Alexander documents in this book, at every stage in the process, there's discrimination. And that discrimination has been challenged before the Supreme Court. And essentially, Michelle Alexander points out how the Supreme Court has closed its doors to civil rights litigants trying to change the racism that exists within the criminal justice system. And so I highly recommend that you read, the book, because it outlines all the important key decisions that basically pave the way for the criminal justice system to target and mass incarcerate African Americans. Now, it's important to realize that this whole war on drugs is a response to the gains of the civil rights movement. The war on drugs started to use slogans like getting tough on crime, and they used coded language to justify their actions. They talked about ending drugs in the community. They talked about fighting criminals. And at the same time that they were doing this, they were also using coded language about ending welfare. And they used a lot of sensationalized news reports, exaggerated news reports to talk about the epidemic of crack and violence in the communities to justify this new war on drugs. Instead of addressing the root causes of problems in the community, problems such as high unemployment in the black community, which is a direct result of the deindustrialization of the black communities and the globalization of the world job market. All of those factors contributed to a lot of the social problems in the black community. They created crimogenic conditions in the black community. But instead of addressing those crimogenic conditions, um, the political establishment decided to focus on a war on drugs. And in order to understand this, you have to understand where we were before this so-called war on drugs. In Michelle Alexander's book, she points out that before 1988, the highest sentence that somebody could receive for drug possession of any amount of drug, of any type of drug, was 1 year. After the enactment of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, there was a 5-year minimum sentence that people could receive for possessing cocaine base. So you have higher sentences, you have, and that's just one example, but there are lots of examples of higher charges, harsher sentences. And, as I pointed out before, because of the discrimination in the criminal justice system, and African Americans have been targeted in this war. And one of the things that was real interesting about this book is the fact that it points out something that many people probably find hard to believe, but it's the truth. White people are more likely to use and sell drugs than black people. In her book, Michelle Alexander cites at least 2 reports that prove this fact. She cites the National Institute of Drug Abuse's 2000 report. She cites the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse. And both of those reports prove that white people are more likely to use and sell drugs than black people. Also, in her book, she cites how there was a study done in New Jersey which pointed out how African Americans were targeted on the highways for stops and searches more so than any other group, and that even though both groups, whites and blacks, violate traffic laws to the same degree, African Americans were disproportionately targeted for stops and searches while driving on the turnpike. And they pointed out how this is the case even though the whites who were stopped were more likely to possess drugs. So those are just more examples of how the system targets African Americans. And when you look at the net result of this targeting, she points to very important statistics. For instance, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug use have been black or Latino, even though more white people use drugs than either of those groups. And right now, African American men are imprisoned more often than white men. For instance, she says that 1 in 14 black men are behind bars compared to 1 in 106 white men are behind bars for drug offenses. And then for young black men, the statistics are even worse. For black men between 21 and 25, the rate is for every 1 in 9 black men, 1 is behind bars. So 1 in 9 young black men are behind bars for drug offenses. And one alarming statistic that she cited in her report was in her book, was just she compared slavery to the present day situation of mass incarceration. And she said that more African American adults are under correctional control today in prison or jail or probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850. So in the words of Kanye West, many of us are new slaves, basically. We are modern day slaves. And the Constitution says that people can be enslaved if they've committed crimes in their sentence. Um, so basically, you have a situation where more people are under the criminal justice system than were enslaved in 1850. And that is outrageous. And it's a shame that more attention is not being drawn to this issue and more action is not being taken. And in her book, she talks about how one of the parallels that she points out between the Jim Crow system and the present day mass incarceration system is just the fact that it is legal to discriminate in both systems. Under Jim Crow, it was legal for the state or the jurisdiction to segregate and discriminate against black people. It was legal for them to erect all kinds of barriers to prevent African Americans from voting, from living in certain places, from going to certain restaurants, from having certain jobs. It was legal at that time during the Jim Crow era. And now today, it is legal for the state and the nation to discriminate against people who have been convicted of felonies, who have served time for using or selling drugs. For instance, you can be discriminated against in employment. Someone can decide not to hire you because you have a criminal history, even if that criminal history is completely unrelated to the job or the duties of that particular job. In her book, she points out how people with felonies in many jurisdictions in this country, they cannot exercise the right to vote. They cannot vote. And she cited how more people are disenfranchised today than were disenfranchised during the slave period. And it is a disgrace that that kind of thing continues to happen. She also points out how felons can be barred from serving on juries. They can be deprived of the right to housing. They can be deprived of access to public housing and even private housing. Private landlords can decide not to allow someone to rent their property based on their conviction. Also, people who have committed felonies, drug offenses, they can be barred from receiving food stamps. And many of them, they leave prison owing debts, and they have to pay debts with their meager wages that they earn if they're able to earn wages. So essentially, you have a parallel system that in many ways mirrors the Jim Crow system, where discrimination is legalized and legitimized by the system. And these statistics should be very alarming to anyone. And this book should be a call to action for the civil rights community. And in the final chapter, Michelle Alexander talks about next steps, what should be done. But, unfortunately, that's like the only problem that I have with this book. I thought that it should have gone into more detail about how to correct this problem. It should have laid out a course of action. Um, and that would probably, as she mentioned in her book, require that a second book be written. But I think that that is something that should have been thoroughly discussed. It wasn't discussed. But she makes great points about how, one possible thing that may need to happen is drugs. We may need to legalize drugs in order to correct this problem of mass incarceration. Because as it stands right now, the drug laws are primarily and selectively enforced in black communities. They are not as aggressively enforced in other communities. So legalization may be one necessary step. And, one thing that we need to do is fight these laws that prevent people from getting employment after they have served their debt to society. After they have served their time, they should not be prevented from seeking employment, because by preventing them from seeking employment, you essentially create a situation where they're more inclined to end up back in jail. They're more inclined to end up continuing to commit criminal acts in order to survive. So we need to create a situation where people have opportunity when they leave prison. They should not be they should not continue to have to suffer under the stigma of their past transgressions or past crimes. They should be given a new lease on life and have the same opportunities that you and I have to vote, to work, and to provide for their families. And one real important thing that she mentions in her books, she talks about how this mass incarceration problem has had a devastating impact on our communities. Um, a lot of our men, are incarcerated as a result of this selective enforcement of drug laws. And that has a devastating impact on our communities. That means many fathers are away from their children. That means that there are a large number of men who are incarcerated that can't be not only fathers, but they can't be husbands or boyfriends to their women. And with the absence of the man in the community, you essentially see the further erosion and destruction of the Black community. And this book really demands that civil rights organizations take action and focus on this issue that has a huge impact on our community.